for tuning in to TBN. Today it is a joy to come into your home. On this edition of Joy in Our Town, I've invited the Rio Grande Foundation along with Goldwater Institute to be a guest today. Today we'll be talking about New Mexico minority students. What lies ahead for them? Are they doomed to fail or achieve academic improvement? Dr. Ladner, Paul, it's a pleasure having you both here today.
Thank you for having me.
Please take a moment, introduce yourselves, and share with us what you both do.
My name is Paul Gessing. I run the Rio Grande Foundation. It's the free market think tank here in New Mexico. We analyze a wide variety of public policy issues, from the ideas of limited government, individual responsibility, and choice, and that includes educational choice and educational achievement. And so we've brought Dr. Ladner here to New Mexico for a series of events and talks with policymakers to promote the idea of educational improvement and ways that we can do that without necessarily spending any more money, which hasn't necessarily proved effective. So we're trying to do this and do this for in a cost-effective way, in a way that will actually benefit all New Mexico students, but it's proven especially to benefit minority students.
Wonderful, thank you.
I'm Matthew Ladner. I'm the Vice President for Research at the Goldwater Institute, which is Paul's sister organization in Phoenix, Arizona.
Well, it's a pleasure having you. Thank you for coming a long way here to help our issues here in New Mexico. I hope we could tap into what Arizona and what Florida is doing. As I mentioned, New Mexico students are doomed either to fail or achieve academic improvement. I've read that states like New Mexico with a growing Hispanic population are doomed to fail. Why do experts feel this way, and why does the Rio Grande Foundation also feel this is an issue when it comes to education policy?
Well, it's unfortunate, but the numbers bear out that minority students don't necessarily do as well as their Anglo counterparts. In New Mexico is a very heavy minority Hispanic population state, but that doesn't necessarily hold true. And Dr. Ladner's found that Florida in particular is one state that has adopted a whole series of educational reforms, and they have experienced a dramatic turnaround in testing results on very well respected, the gold standard of testing, and they're doing much better. So not just wealthy Hispanic kids or certain subgroups ethnically, all Hispanic kids and African American kids in Florida, which is a large population, are doing really well and learning under this new regime.
The study I wrote for Paul actually kind of started off with a story from a different study by a group called the Morrison Institute in Phoenix. They're actually a think tank, left-of-center think tank, headquartered at Arizona State University. And this story, one of the authors of this study from the Morrison Institute was telling us about going to an academic conference, and there was the official state demographer of Kentucky was making a PowerPoint presentation. And he put up a slide that had a map of the United States Southwest on it, and New Mexico and Arizona, Nevada, California, Texas, and pointed at his map and said, "This will be the Appalachia of the 21st century." And then he started to talk about something else, and the audience kind of said, "Whoa, time out. What do you mean?" And the demographer said, "Well, look, here's what we know. We know that all of these states have large and rapidly growing Hispanic populations in schools. And in fact, all of these states have now become what they call majority-minority K-12 populations, led by this very large increase in the Hispanic population." He said, "Well, what do we know about how Hispanics do in school? We know the news is really bad on average. On average, you know, the dropout rates can be as high as 50% for Hispanic students, especially in urban areas. We know that the rates of college attendance are catastrophically low. The percentage of Hispanic students that are even taking an SAT test, much less attending college, also can be very low. We know that among Hispanic students on average in this country, amongst 12th grade Hispanic students that are graduating, right, that didn't drop out, we know that they are graduating, again, on average with a level of academic achievement that is roughly comparable to an 8th grade Anglo student. Okay? We know all these things. All these things are documented. And the demographer basically said, well, so you do the math. This is what's going on. We know these states are becoming increasingly Hispanic in their K-12 population. We also know how Hispanics do in school, so you do the math. And the authors, one of the authors of the report was in the audience, and she objected. And she said, well, Dr. So-and-so, you're just assuming that these states like New Mexico and like Arizona, Nevada, California, you're assuming that we either cannot or will not do better than we have in the past. And this person leans into his microphone and stares at the audience and says, like I said, this will be the Appalachia of the 21st century. Well, the reason I'm here and the reason we wrote this study is to tell people that no, that's not true. Everything all these statistics we know about Hispanic students and how they perform are chilling, and they're very concerning. But the good news is that we have an example of a state that also has a majority minority K-12 population, that also has a lot of low-income kids, that actually spends less per pupil than the public school system here in New Mexico, and which has made enormous progress, especially amongst their low-income and minority students. So, for example, in 2009, on the nation's report card, which is the most reliable set of testing data we have, the Hispanic students in Florida, only looking at Hispanic students in Florida, they tied or outscored the statewide average of 31 different states for all students in the state. Okay, so New Mexico is one of those states. So is my home state of Arizona. When I talk about a statewide average, I'm talking about including all the kids in it, right? So in my state, in Arizona, we're talking about including all the wealthy kids that are going to Scottsdale, all the kids that are, attending places like Flagstaff, the Catalina foothills. Those are included in the sample. We don't do as well as the average for only Hispanic students in Florida, okay? The same is true for African Americans. In 2009, Florida's African Americans score higher on a 4th grade reading test than the statewide average for all students in New Mexico, all students in Arizona, and all students in 6 other states. They either tie or outscore the statewide average for all students. So it didn't used to be that way. Florida used to be down near the bottom of the 50 states along with Arizona and New Mexico, but now they're getting close to the top. And the problem is that we in the Southwest have stayed down there near the bottom. So we need to very carefully take a look at what it is they did, and we need to start doing some of that.
Well, before we jump into that, before talking about how New Mexico can adopt what Florida did, what are reasons why then the Hispanic population or kids are having these troubles, if you will, when it comes to, you talked about the dropout rate. What are some of the challenges or obstacles that they're faced with, if you will, compared to the Anglo students?
Sure. Well, obviously there's often a language barrier to overcome, and that's true in Florida. It's true here in the Southwest as well. But I mean, generally, students dropping out of school is a problem that starts really early. It starts when kids don't learn how to read in the early grades. And educators will tell you that in grades K to 3, kids are learning how to read. And that after 3rd grade, kids are reading to learn. Well, what if you can't read, right? If you can't read, then you literally can't learn. And what happens to kids who don't learn how to read in the early grades, and disproportionately these are African American and Hispanic children, that they wind up not getting those basic literacy skills by the end of the 3rd grade. These children are literally passed along into the late elementary and middle school grades. They get put into science classes in, say, 7th grade, and they're sitting there with a science book in front of them that they can't read. They really literally can't read it and can't understand it. So they start dropping out in large numbers. They don't ever envision themselves going to college. They start to become disruptive, bored. They don't see a future for themselves in education. They start to wonder what they're doing there. Okay, I mean, that's a predictable pipeline of dropouts, but it starts in the early elementary grades. And so to really get a hold of the problem, we really got to focus on early childhood literacy.
And Margaret, I would say that Hispanics in particular tend to be lower income. So income levels, poverty is correlated with not doing as well in school. And also there are certain cultural issues perhaps. It's much more difficult to quantify. Certainly the language and income levels are easy to quantify, but different groups of folks have different values in terms of where they want to see their children in terms of education and whatnot. And I don't think that it's necessary for any ethnic group to maintain a certain worldview in terms of education and achievement or lack thereof. But I think that there is some truth to that. It's just very difficult to quantify.
So then you talked about the language barrier issue. Do you think we need more bilingual education in schools outside of you pointing out, you know, by a certain time if they can't read? Or obviously that needs to be addressed from literally from newborn to what, third grade? Is it third grade?
Third grade is really the cutoff point. You need to learn how to read by the end of the third grade, or it becomes very increasingly difficult after that. I don't think that this is something that is limited to Hispanics. And in fact, in Arizona, I know that in a recent Nation's Report Card exam, that 25% of the non-poor Anglo kids, we're talking about kids that have a family income that is too high to qualify them for a free reduced lunch, 25% of those kids score below basic in reading. Okay, so I think what we have in a lot of the southwestern states, including New Mexico and definitely in Arizona, is we have an across-the-board literacy crisis. None of our student groups are doing very well in learning how to read. There's room for improvement amongst all of them. Of course, there are some differences of issues and challenges, and non-native English speaking is one of those. But the good thing is that the sort of comprehensive approach that they took in Florida worked for all these different student subgroups. Anglos made big gains. African Americans made even bigger gains. The Hispanic students made big gains as well. So, so it's not the issues we're facing are not unique to any one student group. It's something we have an across-the-board problem where our schools are not doing as good a job of teaching kids literacy skills as we need them to do.
Well, okay, a couple of years ago, I couldn't give you the exact time frame because I don't remember, but I did read an article in regards to the U.S. Census Bureau, and I quote, that the Hispanic population is growing, and it's predicted by the year 2020 that classrooms will have Hispanics as the majority. If this is an issue right now, we're at 2010, 10 years down the road is 2020.
Right.
If we don't fix this now, how much more of a chaos or problem is this going to be in 10 years?
Well, it's exactly right. I mean, the great news about the Florida example is that Florida has their Hispanics scoring at such a high level in fourth grade reading that, for instance, let me give you a good example. The Miami-Dade School District is a very large inner-city urban school district. It's 91% of their students are either Hispanic or African American. And we're talking about a tough district.
Okay? 91%, yeah, that's
91%. In 2009, the fourth grade reading scores for Miami-Dade were higher than the statewide average for all students in Oregon. Now, I was in Oregon a couple of years ago. It's a beautiful state, filled with a lot of very affluent people. And I was there for about 4 days, and I don't believe I ran across a Hispanic or an African American the entire time I was there. But Miami-Dade is outscoring them in reading, okay, which tells us something very important, which is this can be done, right? With the right set of school policies and incentives for success, sanctions for failure, parental choice. Florida is the #1 state in the country for parental choice programs. With the right mix of policies, what we see is that we don't have to be doomed. New Mexico does not have to accept becoming the Appalachia of the 21st century at all. It needs to take the steps it's going to take to avoid that. But in the absence of those steps, I think everything that demographer said is going to absolutely come true. It's an option. It's not inevitable. If the policymakers of the state will take the tough decisions, and it will be tough, you can do a lot better than that and have a much brighter future for your children.
With these issues that you're pointing out today, Dr. Ladner, does it strictly have to do with the public school system, or does this also include, if you will, private schooling along with homeschooled students?
Yes, it does include all kinds of different sectors. Florida, Florida is the leading state for parental choice options. So there are, Florida has a tax credit program for low-income children to allow corporations to make donations to nonprofits and receive a tax credit for it, and then the nonprofits provide scholarships for low-income students to attend private schools. Florida also has the nation's largest school voucher program that is for children with disabilities. So children with, with an IEP can take their money if they want in the form of a voucher and go to another public or private school of their choice. Florida also has a very strong charter school law. There's a charter school law here in New Mexico. Florida's is more robust than the one here in New Mexico. And in addition to all that, Florida is actually the nation's leading state in terms of providing virtual education opportunities to children. So you have more and more kids in Florida that are starting to choose between, well, do I want to take math with Mrs. Smith, or would I like to take it through the Florida virtual school, right? And dual credit enrollment, kids being in high school and college at the same time. There's a lot going on in Florida in terms of parental options and homeschooling. And that system of parental choice combined together is really sort of what you the best way to think of it is as a decentralized accountability system where parents can hold schools directly accountable for the way they think they're educating their child. Some of what Florida did is the state lawmakers in Tallahassee and the Florida Department of Education doing tough-minded things to hold schools accountable. But that's from the top down, and you can never rely on the top down forever. Sooner or later, that's going to let you down. The bottom-up approach, however, is completely decentralized. It's out of anyone's control, per se. And what we found is that the more options that parents have, the more healthy competitive pressure they put on school districts to improve, the greater the student learning gains that we see in Florida.
And Margaret, one of the things that educators and policymakers talk about constantly is parental involvement, getting parents involved in their children's education. And that is important. I agree completely, and the findings bear that out, that can be very useful. But you have to give them a reason to get involved. You have to give them some responsibility to make decisions and be engaged in the process of helping their child determine the educational path forward for them. Because if everyone's dumped in the same, first through 5th grade, and then the same junior high, and then the same high school, and there's no choice and there's no ability to really decide your own path, then parents are going to drop out, not be as involved, and just kind of let the education establishment, however well-intentioned or willing to help they may be, just manage their children's educational future. And that's really not a system that's worked well.
So then, okay, if the roadblock, if you will, doesn't rely on the kid or the student, and it relies on the adult or educators or policymakers, how do you ignite a fire in them, especially a parent, to get that passion for their kids' education?
Well, I think it is a chicken or the egg sort of thing. I think you need to give them the ability to make decisions, and they will rise to the occasion. That's not necessarily true for every parent, but what we've seen over the last 50, 60 years is education policy becoming so much driven by the teachers' unions, the education establishment, the political processes, and the parents have really been taken out of that equation. We need to put them back in, and most parents, I think, will rise to the occasion. It's kind of like, I'm not a mechanical person at all, but I can go to the store or go to the auto dealer and look at a Corvette or a nice Honda car or whatever the best car is, a Mercedes. And I understand from reading consumer reports and knowing word of mouth what a good car is. Well, a parent is going to have the same view if they are given information and given the ability to make choices. They may not be a mechanic. I'm not a mechanic either. Or they may not be an educator. But people can make choices if they're given choices and information to empower them. And I really think that's the core and the key to the education reforms that Florida did and their success.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, this is the key insight of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, would say something like, I can walk into a department store now, back when we had department stores, and throw a dart into the computer section, and it's going to land on a computer that is more powerful and cheaper than it would have been 2 or 3 years ago. I can do this despite the fact that I know nothing about computers, RAM, I don't even understand any of this stuff, right? But I can do that because there are other consumers out there making rational choices about these things, and competitive pressure is providing the incentive for the computer makers to provide better and cheaper computers all the time, right? It's an extreme example, but it's instructive, okay? In education, we've gotten completely away from that, and it was nobody's, necessarily the way they wanted things to be, but what we did is to organize our system based on school districts that would have sort of local monopolies, like, attendance boundaries where, okay, you get all the students within this attendance boundary, and the amount of competitive pressure that they would face is extremely limited. Mm-hmm. So that was an important part of what Florida did to increase parental involvement, was simply to give a lot more parental options. Some of the other things they did were also important to spurring parental involvement. Florida curtailed the social promotion of children in the early grades who were not displaying basic literacy skills. That was something that sent a very clear signal back to parents that, hey, look, you need to get your child reading, and we give you homework assignments, you'd better do them, mm-hmm. right? Because if you don't, there's going to be a consequence, right? That got parents more involved. In Florida, they grade all schools, all district and charter schools, according to a formula, and grade them all A, B, C, D, or F, okay? And that is a system that sends a very clear signal out to people. And most states use what we call sort of fuzzy descriptors to grade their schools. Your school doesn't get a D, it gets a label that's called performing, or maybe performing plus, or something equally vague and meaningless to someone that doesn't even know what the scale of what you're talking about. In Florida, they grade all schools A, B, C, D, or F, and they base it in part on overall test scores and in part on student learning gains, and they put a special emphasis on the learning gains of the lowest performing students. Every year you've got to get your bottom 25% of kids from last year's test making gains, or you can't, in effect, get anything better than a C. Okay, and this is a big reason why I think we see these big gains amongst Hispanics and African Americans, and also amongst ELL kids and children with disabilities. They're all making gains in Florida because those are the kids that are in the bottom 25%. But just treating parents like adults by telling them the truth, right, by not trying to sugarcoat things, by telling them, you know what, your child's school got an F or a D, that encourages parental involvement. In fact, when Florida first did this, what happened is the schools that got D's and F's had a real rallying around them of community support, where thousands of people went into the schools and volunteered to tutor the kids, right? That never would have happened if we used these kind of vague, everyone gets a trophy type approaches, to grading schools. Instead, when they went to sort of more of a tough love approach, and one that uses sort of truth in advertising, right? That encourages parental involvement. People, have avoided these sort of things. They're controversial, and a lot of people that work in the systems don't like these sort of things. They view them as punitive, but I don't view them as punitive. I view them as very constructive, because it actually encourages parents to take actions and to be more involved in the educations of their children.
So if other states like New Mexico, because New Mexico is obviously looking into this and hopefully will adopt this, when will we hopefully see this in action?
Well, we have a legislative session coming up in January, and there's no time like the present to contact your legislators and let them know that you support this kind of education reform. We have a governor's race here in November, and one way or the other we're going to see some change in the governor's mansion, and there may be support for that kind of thing from the executive as well. So it's really with our elected officials to push this kind of reform. And the beauty of it is, when Jeb Bush and the folks who did this in Florida did this in the late 90s, they had faith in the ideas of free markets and the kind of things that we've seen interact to make Florida what it is today. They had faith. We have numbers, we have data, we have experiences of real life people doing real life reforms and having real successes. Arizona, the state where Matthew's from and works, and I'm sure it's attributed largely and greatly to his efforts, recently adopted this kind of menu of reforms in Arizona. So we obviously don't have data because it was less than 6 months ago on Arizona, but other states are seeing the success of Florida in adopting these types of reforms. And New Mexico has tremendous problems in K-12 education, really extraordinary problems, and needs to act now for not only the future of children, but for, if you don't have kids, think about the economy. Think about people who might have kids and want to relocate a business to New Mexico, and where they are coming from in terms of bringing jobs and all that. They might consider another state if we don't have a good school for their kids to go to.
I'm glad you brought up that point. We have about a little under 2 minutes left in our segment this morning, gentlemen, but I listen to leaders in the community, get feedback from them as to what they view are pressing issues. One of the issues is competitiveness when it comes to economic competitiveness, and trying to educate this next generation of kids, because as the group right now, starts to retire, what's going to happen? Especially when it comes to competing globally, not just nationally, but globally. By applying this, will that help these kids achieve that goal?
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the first step to any education is learning how to read. And here in New Mexico, about 44% of your fourth graders scored below basic in reading on the last nation's report card. Now, below basic doesn't mean that a child can't read a stop sign. What it means is they basically can't read Dr. Seuss, and that's got to stop, because what happens to these kids is they fall further and further behind grade level and they start dropping out. That process has got to stop. It has got to come to an end. And when we talk about economic development, I can promise you this, the Florida Chamber of Commerce is in a position to say, come to Florida, because our minority students outscore statewide averages all over the country. That's where New Mexico needs to be.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the program this morning. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Please, if you would like more information on this subject, you're more than welcome to go to the Rio Grande Foundation's website, or you can call 505-264-6090. Tune in next week. Have a beautiful day, and may God bless.
This program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network and made possible by your telephone dollars. Your continual support can keep Joy in Our Town brought to your home every day. So write Joy in Our Town, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.